All right, so it's my tremendous pleasure to introduce Dr. Cassie Smith-Christmas, who is a researcher at the National University of Ireland in Galway. She received her PhD from the University of Glasgow in Celtic and Gaelic. Her work examines multilingualism, language shift and maintenance, family language policy, minority language issues, and a host of other different things that she works with. She was recently a Marie Sklodowska Curry Action Fellow and a recipient of the Irish Research Council, Government of Ireland, Postdoctoral Fellowship, and the Salisa Fellowship. She was a co-PI on the Sustaining Minoritized Languages in Europe, or SMILE initiative, with the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. She is the author of Family Language Policy, Maintaining an Endangered Language in the Home, as well as co-editor of 2 volumes, Gaelic and Contemporary Scotland, The Revitalization of an Endangered Language, and New Speakers of Minority Languages, Linguistic Ideologies and Practices. She has been published in the journal Pragmatics, Journal of Multilingual and Multicultural Development, Current Issues in the Language Planning, Language Culture and Curriculum, and the International Journal of the Sociology of Language. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Cassie Smith-Christmas.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much for that really kind introduction. It's absolutely wonderful to quote unquote be there. So yeah, thanks so much for inviting me to talk. I'll just share my screen now. It's still in presenter mode, I see, but I'll just share it, go back to the original slide, and yes. There we go. Is it big? Is it? All right, great. So I have to say, it's fantastic to be invited to this group, but learning what all the wonderful things that you're researching, I just want to say that this might be a bit less linguistic than the other talks, but hopefully, but don't worry, there is lots of linguistics in there. But this is more related to sort of language policy, language planning, and especially my work with families and children. So what I'm going to be talking about is this idea of facilitating Saibhreas. And if you don't know what that word is, don't worry, I'll explain it. Navigating issues of authenticity in the intergenerational transmission of Irish. And I'd like to first of all thank my co-PI on this project. So most of this is from the SMILE project that John nicely mentioned with the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. So my co-PI on this project was Orla Rochelle. And I'd also like to give a special thanks to Mary Burke, who also contributed to this project. So as I said, a lot of my work has to do with this idea of intergenerational transmission. And we know that intergenerational transmission is hugely important, and it's really sine qua non for revitalizing languages. So for example, Remain calls it the pulse of language revitalization lying in the youngest generation. And then, oh dear, my slide ran away from me. And Mosley then, in talking about the language vitality, considers a language as definitely endangered if the mother tongue is not transmitted in the home. And of course, if we're familiar with Fishman's Gibbs scale, stage 6, that he characterizes stage 6, the intergenerational transmission of the language at home, as sine qua non to language revitalization. So there, we know it's really important. However, one of the difficulties that I see with this is that when we think about it, it's this sort of tacit understanding of, right, the language should be poured into the children, and then the children will speak this language. But I think there's a lot of difficulties with conceptualizing, first of all, what is it we want to pour? And then what do we want to be in the child? How do we conceptualize successful intergenerational transmission? Now, I am not the first one to problematize this particular question. James Costa, for example, writes in his book on Occitan about the ambiguous nature of children in language revitalization movements, and how this, how future children embody the future, but it's a bit uncertain what the future they embody is, and also do they understand the norms that they are required to act according to. So the key question that I'm going to be looking at today is, how do we conceptualize this successful transmission of a minority language? And with that, what are the tensions emergent? And how can these tensions be resolved? And don't worry if you're like, but what are these tensions? I'll be talking about what these tensions are and how they manifest. So, as I said, this has to do with a project that was done with the Smithsonian's minoritizing language, sustaining minoritized languages in Europe. And this was done in concert with 5 other teams. And our main question was, okay, what works in language revitalization and what doesn't? What is best practice? And with this project, I had the absolute pleasure of working with Dialectal Orthography, the project that was looking at this particular language revitalization, language development center in the Corcagwina Gaeltacht. And so that's where it's located. So a Gaeltacht, for anyone who's not familiar with the term Gaeltacht, so a Gaeltacht is an officially designated Irish-speaking area within the Republic of Ireland. And for our purposes, in talking especially about children and language transmission, that one thing to note is that all schools within Gaeltacht areas are Irish immersion schools. And that circle is where the beautiful Corcagwina Gaeltacht is located. This is a much closer view, and most of the work took place in Ballyferriter, which is where Ira Corcagwina is located. And in case you need more context of where this is, these friends can help you. If anyone wants to put in the chat what the translation of this is in Irish. You don't even have to know that much Irish to be able to translate that. But if anyone wants to put in the chat, just so I can see you are awake. But if so, so that is a long time ago. Mulchin, so Bulchin is the local form of the name Ballyferriter. And the reason why Yoda and Darth Vader come to greet you when you arrive in this is that the Corcagwina Gaeltacht, this area, is the setting, some of the setting for the new Star Wars films. So the island that Luke Skywalker goes to is set there. So there is your context. Now you can picture it. So in terms of language transmission, so in the 2016 census, which is the most recent census here in Ireland, in terms of the number of people who can speak Irish in the Corcagwina Gaeltacht, you'll see that it's quite high, so over 70%. However, when you look at the number of speakers who speak Irish outside of the education system on a daily basis, which is the proxy that is used for home and community transmission of the language, you can see a quite marked difference. So you can see that it's under 30%. And this then parallels the national survey, which also finds a very high percentage of people who can speak Irish, but then the number of people who speak Irish outside of the education system. So I mentioned in a Gaeltacht area that all schools are Irish immersion. Well, in the Republic of Ireland as well, you also have Irish as a compulsory subject in school. So even if you don't live in a Gaeltacht area, even if you don't go to an immersion school outside of the Gaeltacht, if you go to school in Ireland, you will have Irish in your education. So that's why that number is the proxy for the best guess we can have of home and community language transmission. And then when you look at the smaller studies, the more localized studies that were done on this particular area, we can see a quite nice matchup. So if we're thinking, okay, around just under 30% as home language speakers, we can see this mirrored pretty well then in the very excellent and detailed language plan for Corcagwina, which they give number of different views of language vitality. And one of these is the language ability of children entering preschool. And as you can see here, about 20% were estimated as home language speakers, and then 6% as competent. So taken together, we can see about 26, we can maybe guess around 26 to maybe about over 30% are being socialized in Irish at home. So again, a low number compared to the high number that can speak the language. And this just doesn't come out of space. This has been noted for a long time. So since O'Regan's 1992 study of Corcagwina, and then also Taig O'Herfinan's well-known study in family language policy studies, in which he quoted that parents frequently remarked that there are no accidental Irish speakers anymore, meaning that there is an awareness that community transmission was down, and it wasn't just quote unquote natural to speak to children in Irish anymore, as it had been a generation before, where all your neighbors, all your friends, your relatives, everyone would have been speaking, most people would have been speaking Irish to their children. So from that, there was a targeted intervention, and that's called TUSMA, which means good start in Irish. And this was modeled in part on the program TUV in Wales. And TUSMA is part of IROC Corcagwina. So IROC Corcagwina is the overall center, and they coordinate a number of different language initiatives. And then TUSMA is the strand of that deals specifically with supporting families and children use the Irish language. So they have a number of different initiatives within this overall umbrella program, such as, for example, supporting parents in making the decision to speak Irish to their children in the first place, playgroups, a number of resources such as children's books, CDs, games in Irish, then also special things, seasonal things, such as a Christmas Day. So seeing Daddy Nolig, which is Santa Claus in Irish. And their Santa Claus does speak Irish. And then also initiatives for older children to engage in different activities together through the Irish language. So this project was very, very ethnographic, and it was looking at all of IROC Corcagwina's initiatives. And it mainly involved participant observation, which was just great fun for me, the researcher, in that I got to take part in all these different initiatives. And with that, also there are semi-structured interviews with different people who were involved in intergenerational transmission in this area. And so when I use the word practitioner, I realize that this might seem strange for an audience based in North America, but I don't mean doctors or anything. What I mean is people who work with children in different ways. So what we'd call early years practitioners. So just to make that clear. And from this, I would say that, okay, so thinking about intergenerational transmission, I've always been quite interested in this question of what do we mean by successful intergenerational transmission and how can we make it work? And one of the sort of key moments on this journey in understanding more about the process of intergenerational transmission came from a day that was specifically for developing a continuing professional development day for practitioners working with children. So practitioners working with children in the preschool, and then also home visitors. So one of the other strands of Too Small is the home visitor scheme, where people will go, Irish speakers will go into people's houses and help on a weekly basis and help develop children's language skills and caregivers' language skills within the home. So this is our happy, wonderful day out in Killarney. You can tell that it's 2018. There is no mask. We are holding hands. We are having fun. And so this day, I think, really crystallized this idea that was going around in my head really for quite a few months about how can we sort of put a shape on this very broad and sometimes seemingly ethereal nature of intergenerational transmission and what success looks like. So this is the model that I'll be speaking about. So what I propose is that when we think about intergenerational transmission, when we think of how caregivers conceptualize success, that a useful way for us participating in this project of successful intergenerational transmission is this idea of Saibhreas. And Saibhreas translates to richness in Irish. And before this particular workshop, that I'll be showing you excerpts from the handouts from this workshop in a minute, Saibhreas, the word Saibhreas, kept on popping up again and again throughout the interviews, that people would talk about how they want the children to have Saibhreas Changa, richness of language. And so from this, I started thinking about, well, I think we can put a shape on this. And certainly in Corcaguina, I see three main facets in terms of this shape. So the first part of the shape is what, and these are all tied together. So fitcha fucha, as you would say in Irish. So all tied and entwined together. So the first one is what we normally think about when we think about linguistic competence and children acquiring any language. So the first part of Saibhreas is that the children's language use is competent, so that it aligns with age-appropriate speech norms, syntax, morphology, phonology, etc. It is there. That is competence. The second dimension then is local. And this came across quite strongly, both in the practitioner day, as you'll see from the handout, and also throughout the interviews, that people wanted their children to sound like their children were from Corcaguina. And then the third part is where it goes a bit more into the social emotional dimension of language. But I think that this is very important, that not only when we think about, okay, going back to the water vessel analogy, not only when do we think about pouring the language into the children, but we think about, okay, well, what are the children doing with the language? What is their relationship with this? So with this, I argued that another way to look at intergenerational transmission when people imagine intergenerational transmission is that they're imagining children who want to speak the minority language and who can experience the totality of their social and emotional worlds throughout the minority language. So this is very much related to the idea that I showed you before in the census number, that you have high numbers of people who can speak Irish, but we're not sure if they are. And so I'll start with the embodied one, because I know for a crowd that's more linguistically oriented, this might seem a bit into space. But the idea very much, and I just want to say, by my meaning of how I'm using embodied, I don't just mean the physical nature, but it draws on Cortis's notion of embodiment as the existential ground of culture and self. And the former director of Ira Corcohuina, I think, put it beautifully, of Irish as a language that you can live through. So that when you have an embodied relationship with a language, it is a language that you can live through, instead of just, for example, a school subject, as sometimes happens with minority languages, Irish included. So I argue that this embodiment, therefore, is this mediating link between competence, between language competence, the competence dimension, and then the use, the actual use of the language. Now I'm going to go, I promised there would be more linguistic things. So now I'm going to go more into the two linguistic elements. So competence and then the local dimension. So these two are very, very reminiscent about Will's concept of BLOS. So Will did work on the Isle of Lewis with children who were in Gaelic medium education. And in her excellent thesis, she talked about this concept of BLOS, so which means taste, but accent as well. But it's more than that. And I think she demonstrates it very well. And she talks about how it may be described as a set of linguistic and paralinguistic elements, including dialectal register and variance, prosody, and the use of idiomatic expressions, which combine to bestow an almost palpable aesthetic quality to one's speech. And I think aesthetically, her writing is very nice. So that's why I read out that quote. So I think that the local and the competence dimensions very much align with this notion of BLOS. And so here are some examples from the handouts then that sort of describe how practitioners and also how the leader of this particular workshop was orienting towards these main sort of these main categories. So in the workshop was about Krunius Changa, which means accuracy of speech. So it was very much dedicated towards facilitating practitioners, people working with children, to be able to facilitate the children's accuracy of language. So accuracy of grammar, accuracy of structure. And so for part of the workshop, what we did was talk about common grammatical, common errors that are made, common ways that a child's language use might not align with what would be expected in terms of adult norms for having Krunius Changa. And I'm sort of hedging this, and I'm saying it very carefully because I want to emphasize that I think one of the reasons why this workshop worked so well and why ultimately Ira Corcohuina and Tusma are so are so successful in facilitating intergenerational transmission was the dialogue and talking about the sort of porous boundaries and the considerations that one has to make when participating in language revitalization, and especially in navigating this line between what might be seen as purism and what might be seen as facilitating children's enjoyment and embodiment of the language. So in one part, so this was the bit that was all in agreement, that we talked about, right, okay, these are sort of common mistakes, and, you know, if you hear that, you can do, you know, model, recast it, et cetera, et cetera. Then when we got into other grounds, though, so these were all pretty much agreed on that, yes, if a child said that, I would, you know, come up with a way of recasting it so that they would get correct input. However, when it came to different examples, the facilitator of the workshop mentioned the example of forfa, and there was some question about it. So forfa means perfect in Irish. It is a word in Irish. It means perfect. The reason why it was in this gray area of calking was because in Irish English now, if somebody says, if you call up a restaurant and say, hi, I'd like to make a reservation at 8 o'clock, and somebody says, perfect, that means, okay, you have your reservation. And people say perfect all the time. So the facilitator was pointing that out as, well, that's a calque. So, and that's coming from English. So that's something that should be corrected. But there was a bit of give and take. Some of the practitioners said, well, I don't know if I would correct that. So there is debate, and there was discussion about these particular boundaries. Now, the last item of the list, so your own dialect, the dialect of Corcaguina, was what really gave rise to this idea of local. So local, by that, I mean that children's language use aligns with local norms. And so a lot of this workshop, so in addition to facilitating the Krunischanga, so the discussions about accurate language, there was a lot to raise practitioners' meta-linguistic awareness about their own dialect. And part of this, much of this was aimed, on the one hand, at facilitating confidence in practitioners using their own dialect with the children, and the importance of that for the children's own input. But there is, and this is where I'm talking about the emergent tensions and how I think Iraq Corcaguina handles these tensions so well. There comes then a tension between a potential tension, yeah, that has nice alliteration, between the standard and then the local dialect. And that comes to head when teaching children. So that is, so the facilitator of the workshop advised, yes, please use your dialect, have pride in your own dialect and use your dialect. But there's a sort of fine balance you have to strike when writing it. And so she gave examples and then talked about how they would be written. And she advised practitioners that if you're writing dialectally, fine, use it. But if you're writing specifically for children, for exercises, for example, then it's best to use the standard. And I'll talk about that more in terms of wider research in a minute. But just here, so these are all my notes that I was furiously scribbling down there. So the one exception to that was the example of in Irish, if you have the intensifier, then it's the intensifier and then the noun. In Munster Irish, you get epenthesis, then followed by lenition. And so anava, for example, instead of anwa, as you would get in the standard. But the facilitator says, well, that's so common. You can do that. If you're writing for children, you know, put in, she didn't say the epenthesis, but everyone knew what she was talking about there. But there was, again, this wasn't sort of fixed. There was some discussion about this. So someone said, you know, well, why can't I just write dialectally? That's how I would write, and that's their dialect. And one of the things that the facilitator brought up was this very potentially slippery slope of dialectal orthography. And she gave the example of a local poet who would use the word, who would use the form call instead of, because that's how it's said, so call, but use the shortened version. So that means where is. So ka is the where, and then will is the copula. So the where is, so where is something. And she noted that, well, okay, you could use that, but then in terms of the child's potential learning of this as a written form, then they're missing out seeing that this then relates to ka-will, relates to an-will. So they're missing out seeing that copular form. So that's how these tensions were dealt with within the workshop. Now, I think they resonate very much with wider efforts to both simultaneously valorize the local, the authentic, at the same time of understanding that there will be, that there are other forms, including the standard. So I think that part of the success of the workshop was not only helping enable facilitators to have confidence in using the dialect, but it also raised meta-linguistic awareness of, you know, that children might come, they might use a different form, and not to necessarily mark it as deviant. And I think this plays with this fine balance in terms of authenticity. So something that Woolard has talked a lot about, so that speech forms have value if they're located in the authentic. Something is authentic if it has these embedded territorial and social roots. But as Cresswell points out, that what can happen is that there can be this sort of divide then between the us and them. And there was very much quite a tangible awareness of the need to walk this very fine balance between valuing the authentic and valorizing it, and at the same time not reproducing potential divisions. And this resonates very much with O'Murcha's extensive work in talking about standard varieties of Irish, and then in terms of Gaeltacht varieties, specific Gaeltacht varieties. And so here, what he says is that there's the need to both valorize the Gaeltacht varieties as well as valorize the standard, to have a standard written form, which is very much in line with what the facilitator was saying. And I think that underlying this all was this very, very strong notion of the need for the three circles to be in balance with each other, to be in harmony. And that if, as seen in this picture, the competent and the local sort of balloon out, then it can upset the embodied. So if there's emphasis in a particular way, if a child's told, no, that's not right, that's not right, that's not right, there's the potential for that to be, to the embodied, which, as I've argued, is the mediating link between competence and use. And so thinking about, okay, how do we keep the three in harmony and supporting all three at the same time? So I'm just going to run through some little examples that I think are nice ways that Airach, Corcahuina, and Tusma facilitate this harmony. So not trading one for the other, but keeping all the three circles in harmony for the Saibhreas. So one of these examples are these lovely books that they've produced, or Luan. And here, so the books are written primarily for caregivers to read to the children, and they use the local forms, but then they gloss what the forms would be in the Kaijan then at the end of the books. And then I'm going to play you a little song and then talk about this lovely little song. So this is one of the CDs that Airach Corcahuina produced, which translates to "I'm a happy chicken."
Chicken Michigan song, the sauce, the luncheon songs, the day. Я финишер морозки, айни не блина, не скопинвы. Chicken Michigan song, the sauce, the luncheon songs, the day. Я финишер морозки, айни не блина, не скопинвы.
So you had some nice singing there. And so now I'm going to play you just the clip of the male singer on the CD talking about the importance of this CD. And I think, well, I'll play it first, and then so you can hear beautiful Corcahuina Irish, and then I'll talk a bit how this aligns with these notions of Saibhreas.
Couple of brilliant. I told on because on the footage on the wallage, I mean, on the bill.
Okay.
Shaska brilliant and Coca brilliant. No, we see all the whole of our but she just didn't make on the one that. Leo Shikin, Shikin Michel, Shikin Michel, son of Sosto, Tom Shitsons, Tui on Louis, Fiachenische Moroski, Heini, Edibuli, Northern is Gobin Bui. It's recognized in the land, it's a spot over, it's edible, it's called, it's not around, it's a son of sauce, the Vigora Kata, it's pinched, Pinalani pain, Lani Belganish, which is 9 Belganish, where pinched called sauce, that is given a chicken sauce. You know, I get so list to talk over. I was such a moon, Saibhreas, no girl, no boy, you know, a bit Moroski, Heini, a bit was Edibulina, or the Gobin, but such a question play a pause, and you have to learn or rods on the even and girl, just a no you know, so really big a martian, so on, and really big, it's a little tight, I'm naive to so and then the Rotso, she said, again, just be one of going to just the microphone.
So I have some parts highlighted here. So I think it's really nice. Well, first of all, he says the word Saibhreas and talks about how the CD and how something really simple, such as this one little song, is teaching kids the Munak Saibhreas Nugelana, teaching the Saibhreas, the richness of the language. And he picked out a few examples, so Moraskianin, so he's talking about in that one, then the lenition that you would get on Ra, on Gobin Bui, so noun, adjective, word order. And then he also, so those are the sort of competence parts. And then I think you also get this really nice example of embodiment here, of that the children are happy because the chicken is happy, so that they are living their worlds through Irish. And then also in terms of local, so within this one, song, also you get his use of the local variant, which you might have heard in his speech as well. So Tomsha and so there's no palatalization on that word, whereas in other dialects it would be and show. So here, I think within this tiny little song, we see an example of Saibhreas and how Saibhreas is conceptualized there, that they have, this grammatical, they have the correct grammatical forms, and that they live through, in this case, they're living through this chicken. And then also he uses these particular, he doesn't mention necessarily the dialectal forms, but he uses them in the song. And then finally, so you might say, well, okay, we've seen the jug of water being poured in. Now, what happens? Do the children actually speak the language? And I know this is just one example, but I'm knee deep in a monograph writing about how, yes, the children in Corcahuina, the ones that I had the pleasure of working with, many of them, they did. They spoke Irish. They spoke Irish all the time, and they had Saibhreas. So I just wanted to play you one final example there. 3 years old. Great. So she's 3 years old here. And as you can see, and as you can hear, she is a very competent speaker of the language. She definitely has that dimension. In terms of the local dimension, not only does she use a parenthesis followed by lenition, so anakuch, but she also uses the local form of what speakers here would call Irish, anakuch, gwilyn, nish. So Irish, so that's the bit in purple. And then also, hopefully you can see that she's very excited to speak the language. This is the language that she is choosing to speak, and she's very happy that the Teddy speaks Irish as well. So on that happy note then of children and Teddy speaking Irish, I'll leave you there. And these are just, so most of this has been written up already in a book that I think will be out next year, published, edited by Wilson McLeod and Michael Hornsby. And then I'm also currently working with Orla Rochelle also with the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, in working on a set of videos that will help support parents speak Irish to their children. Those aren't up yet, but Too Small has been doing a number of videos, smaller videos to help support parents. So I put a link there as well. So Gurv Mila Magav, thanks so much for being here.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Cassie Smith Christmas. We have a number of questions, and if you have additional questions, feel free to put either them in the chat or just put in the chat, I have a question, and we'll make sure to get to you. Mm-hmm. So the first question, I'm going to go to Mike here. You're asking about the ability to speak Irish. I'll turn it over to you to ask the question.
Oh, just this was a great talk. Thank you. It was the slide where you had 70% of the people could speak the language, mm-hmm. but only 30% were actually using it. And I'm wondering, and they were only using it in a school setting. Mm-hmm. So what I'm wondering is, of that 70% that says they have ability, what is there some notion of how good that ability is? Maybe a large percentage of them wouldn't be competent to actually. So do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. Yeah, and I should point out that the 70%, it doesn't mean they're not using Irish at all. It doesn't mean that they're just using Irish in school. You know, they could be many years out of school, but it means that they're not using it on a daily basis. So, and we don't have numbers on in terms of the census doesn't ask about competence, but the idea of mishnah, the idea of competence, a competence in using a language is a huge issue. So the numbers that I gave you for the children going into preschool, if you click on the link there to the Plain Changa, that has a whole section about initiatives designed to help speakers build their competence in the language, and actually some really, really nice cartoons that IROC Corcagwina has worked with a local artist in trying to get this notion out there of use the language, even if at first it might be scary. So that's a great question, and that's a large part of what IROC Corcagwina does in terms of specifically adult programs with learning and using the language, that it's not just, that it's meant to be part of community life. But yeah, confidence is a huge, huge issue. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, it looks like the next question is from Andrew. And you're sort of talking about transmission in the home. Do you want me to just pass it over to you?
Yeah, I'll take it on. So first of all, also fantastic talk, so interesting, and I just adored that little girl. She was amazing. But actually, let me ask my second thing first, or it's really just a comment, not a question. I have two things. So you might be interested in some work that was done by an alumnus of University of Arizona, Colleen Patton.
Oh, I know Colleen.
Yeah, so she wrote her dissertation, and I think she could have really benefited from this notion of Saibhreas that you've come up with, or that you're identifying for us, because she was working with second language learners, and the whole notions of authenticity really are very similar here. And I thought it was interesting that such disparate groups of language users and acquirers would have very, very similar sort of sociolinguistic issues sitting around them. So anyway, that was my observation. Her dissertation is available if you're ever...
Oh, yeah, no, I know. I had the pleasure of Colleen came to speak at a conference I hosted in Galway back in the happy days where we could host conferences. I think that there are a lot of similarities, certainly, across minority languages, whether it's Gaelic or Irish in terms of authenticity. I think that in Ireland, there is, because there is a long history of standardization, and there is a long history of people who are not from the Gaeltacht going to Gaeltacht areas and learning the language, that there is quite an awareness to have flexibility, to have an inclusive outlook towards speakers who might not speak the variety that you might have grown up with. And I think that that's part of what the CPD Day in Killarney was doing, was saying, all right, that even though this might not be what you're used to, it's still okay. Some things might be okay, or, pick and choose your battles, maybe is a good way to say it. But yeah, authenticity is a huge question across minority languages, especially with new speakers. Yeah.
That's fascinating. It actually, the issue of incomers is actually my real question.
Okay.
So I've only been to Dingle once, 35 years ago, but my impression when I was there was about the language shift that happened in the summer. And because it's a beautiful place, you get massive incomers of tourists, in particular, not just language learner tourists, not just linguistic tourists, but real tourists. And I wondered, if you had any thoughts about how that might affect the usage of the language, not just in the community, but in the home. So are people not only switching their linguistic usage, more pivoting it towards English in public contexts, but also pivoting in private contexts when the community as a whole is shifting towards English, much more it's already English oriented, but much more towards English?
Yeah, that's a really good question. A quite loaded question, actually, in Corcahuina terms, in terms of, especially, I didn't mention this, but so there are some. When I was doing part of the field work, there was a bit of discussion about Star Wars and Star Wars tourism. And so don't worry, they like Star Wars fans. I have to be very careful. They like Star Wars fans. But this sort of tension of, are things being are sort of, is the focus turning towards Corcahuina as a Star Wars destination, which then is English, or is it still, as it has been, a tourist destination, not only for the beautiful landscape, but specifically for the Irish language? So there was that sort of debate going on. And I did hear someone say, well, it's all right because tá Jedi training sa Gaeilge. So Jedi training is in Irish. So that was offered there. But no, it is a good question. Another thing that arises in terms of the the tourism question. So Mairead, if you're interested in this, Mairead Moriarty has written some excellent articles about this, and especially about Endang and Dingle and tourism and the naming of the main town. Is it Dangan? Is it Endangan, Dangan, Nahush? All these sort of different issues. In terms of, but about Irish language use is that actually, I guess when I was writing the report, there was an article in the paper where somebody wrote into the paper and they were really angry that they had gone to Dingle and they didn't hear much Irish. So it is a sort of interesting thing of at the same time that, yes, people will accommodate by speaking English to tourists. But at the same time, there's also this understanding that that people are coming there for the Irish language. So I had an interesting experience. My parents came for one of my fieldwork trips and stayed for a few days with me on their trip to Ireland. And so we were going around, and my parents are American. We were going around. And so I kind of played a bit of a spy, because I was like, okay, let's see how people react when I think that they think I'm American, and then would switch. And but then I also had the same thing that people, since they knew me, they'd speak to me in Irish, and then they would speak to my parents in Irish, even though my parents didn't understand what they were saying. But they assumed that because I was with they were with an Irish speaker. That's the sort of norm there, that if you address one person in Irish, you just, unless somebody says, hey, this person doesn't speak Irish, I found that generally people would just speak Irish. So it is a bit of a different situation. I don't think that people are switching in the home because of the tourists, but I do think that, yes, when any place has to have a reliance on tourism, that there is the danger of the majority language taking over different spaces, which is why there's been a lot of great work in new business initiatives in Corcahuina, looking at it as a sustainable community and not reliant on tourism, shall we say.
Thank you. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
All right, Andrew Zupon has a question about media and digital spaces.
Yeah, so I'm
about the concept of embodiment.
Yeah.
Your sound went out there, Andrew. We heard you well for a split second.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, I'm being weird and turning off. If it cuts out, just let me know. But question.
It's like cutting off, like it does like this, like you come in and then you come back out.
What about now?
No.
Yeah, I'm so sorry about that, Andrew. If you write out your full question in the chat, or if you'd like me just to read what you have there. Okay, I'll ask it. All right. Question from Andrew Zupon is, how is embodiment handled in media or digital spaces with respect to dialectal variation?
That's a great question. So in terms of the things that, in terms of the digital spaces that Ira Korkwina and that TUSMA is promoting, so those are very much centered on embodiment. So if you click on the link, you'll see all these wonderful things about children and doing different activities with children. Reading Making Soup Out of Nettles is one of my favorite videos. And within those, because it's Ira Korkwina, it's mainly, from what I see from the videos, local speakers. So it is mainly the dialect that is used there. In terms of the wider Irish language media landscape, I think that there's a very sort of conscious choice in some instances, in many instances, I think, to give a balance between the different dialects, and that each dialect is valorized. So embodiment. So I'm going to talk about a soap opera now, if you're interested. So the Irish language soap opera, Ross na Rún. It's very consciously speakers of the main dialect areas. So you have your people from Donegal. It's set in Connemara, so it's set down the road here in Galway. And then you also have your speakers from Munster, your Kerry Irish speakers. So, and I guess that's a way of talking about embodiment, that it is a real life language. And yeah, John Walsh has written quite a lot about that. If you're interested, he's talked a lot about Irish language and the media and the valorization of different dialects. So I hope that answers the question. Okay, great.
All right. Jesus has a follow-up question based on that last question.
Oh, I was wondering, when I was looking at the Venn diagram that you had, where, or if you would add gesture study, like gestures, where would that fall into, in the sense of, would it be like more of like an aid for embodiment and to create the richness, or I don't know. I'm wondering if you would add basically gestures into that Venn diagram.
That's a really, really good question. Would I mean, I think, yeah, I'm not 100% sure, because that's more about norms.
Yeah.
I would say, an understanding of these sort of local norms.
I every time I hear like embodiment for like language learning and whatnot, I always think of gestures and how we use our bodies to either teach or learn a language. And so that's something that I was thinking. I was like, I wonder where would this be? Yeah. Yeah,
no, that's a good question, because that's why I have to sort of explain what that I just don't, that it's not necessarily physical when I'm talking about embodiment. Because I mean, I had about 3 iterations of that term of, what am I trying to say here? And embodiment was the best that I got. But yeah, I would say that it would probably fall under embodiment. But I think that that's a really good point, that just learning norms. So how to conceptualize particular norms of communication and where that follows. So thank you. I might have to make a note or
Yes.
even make new pictures, but I enjoy doing that. So
Awesome. Yeah, I have this book called like Embodied and Cognitive Science, and then there's another one. I could send them to you. They kind of talk more about that stuff, like how.
yeah, I'd love that.
Okay.
Yeah.
No problem.
And then we have a question from Mike about the arts, Welsh arts.
Okay, I'm back. Sorry. When you were talking about, I think this is about embodiment. It may just be me not understanding, but about the kids wanting to use the language. And I was thinking of a characterization of Welsh that I heard a couple people give at one point. That when, little kids are learning, or rather, little kids in Welsh language settings, they're sort of exposed to the language. But when they get into sort of high school, they bifurcate such that kids who are interested in the arts, music or literature or even, visual arts, they'll stay with Welsh. The kids who are interested in the sciences or engineering tend to move into an English sphere. So it's I guess my question is whether one's desire to use the language, or whether the language can fulfill your needs, is also connected to these sort of other interests that you have. Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes complete sense. Yeah. And I must say that one of the things that we identified, so near the end of the project, we had a public meeting where we talked about the results, our main findings, and then asked all this input from various people in the community some of whom had participated in the project, and some of whom were newer to the project. And one of the main gaps that we identified is there's not a lot of support. That's an area that needs further development, support for secondary school students, and for them to have continued their positive emotional relationship with the language. And I would say I couldn't say whether that was the Welsh example that you gave was necessarily happening in Cor Cucuina, but I think that yes, on some level, the fact that so many of the arts things would be through Irish, and there is so much emphasis on that, and it's wonderful. Oh my goodness. So one of the things that I didn't get to talk about, but is just this wonderful initiative there, is Skol Ceolanari, and that's a winter music school, a week-long winter music school, children from all over the country, but a lot of local children, all through Irish. Some things because of the competencies of the instructors maybe aren't, but that's mainly because they bring in people from wonderful places all over the world, talented musicians, so they might not speak Irish, but it's very much an Irish-centric, completely valorizing the connection between the rich musical culture in Cor Cucuina. So I would say that is part of it, and that, yeah, maybe there's more scope to develop specific science-oriented activities. I will say that the aquarium does offer, the local aquarium does offer tours, and they had an open day. And I noticed that once they noticed that children were speaking Irish, they spoke Irish to them. So, so there is, but I would agree that that's something that could be developed. Yes.
Yeah, I have it that suddenly came an example. We have a colleague here in the physiology department, and she's a Welsh speaker from Wales, but her PhD is in physiology, And her family, she grew up in a family that was very committed to Welsh language education.
Mm-hmm.
And she did, her primary and secondary and undergraduate all through the medium of Welsh and was very committed to it. But of course, her intellectual interest shifted to physiology. And, she describes, or she has described to me in detail this sort of experience of feeling like it's almost painful the way she described it, of this subject that she loves, and then the language that she loves and that connects her to her family and her community, and that those had to separate. And that was really, and she ended up doing her graduate work in England, which of course magnified that thing, and ended up in Arizona, which magnified it further. So I think the people who live those lives where they feel they must choose between, the language and community and that other thing, that's a
I think that makes total sense. And I've actually seen it also points out to, the asymmetry of the languages in, the majority minority distinction of, there might be the vocabulary for all things for a specific scientific subject in Irish, but they wouldn't be widely available, and especially to children. So I have an example of children who very much completely Irish their home language all the time, but one of them had a wonderfully strong interest in marine biology at a very young age. She's still young now, but that, in terms of the things that he wanted to watch and read, they were only, Blue Planet isn't available in Irish. The books that he was reading, the very, very scientific books that he was reading were available in English. So absolutely. So that's a big gap that, there's a lot of great initiatives, but it just points out the asymmetry.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, that's about all the time we have for questions. So I'd like to, again, first and foremost, thank Dr. Cassie Smith-Christmas for coming visiting us during this last little bit of our semester. I'd like to thank everybody for coming to the presentation, all the participants and audience members. And we'll be starting this up again. Do we happen to know when and who's going to be our next speaker by chance?
If she gets back to me, Bernadette O'Rourke has tentatively agreed, or it's signed on to join us on January 28th. And Dr. Smith-Christmas mentioned John Walsh. He'll be joining us in, I believe, April. So I'll update the website and we'll have a full list for you soon.
All right, awesome. Well, happy holidays to everybody until then.
Thanks so much.
Thanks
you
again.
for having me. Thank you.
Great.
Oh, Nelly, 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 oh.